Summer, 1590. Japan stood on the edge of a new era. For more than a century, the land had been torn by the ambition of warlords, blood spilled over rice fields, and loyalties shattered like glass beneath an iron heel. But now, a single man, once a peasant, now a master of nations, prepared to bring it all to an end. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was no ordinary warlord. Sharp of tongue and unmatched in cunning, he had risen under Oda Nobunaga, then seized the mantle of unification when his master fell. He had subdued the mightiest clans in the west, pacified Kyushu, and now only one force remained, the Hōjō clan of the east. The Hōjō ruled the Kantō region, a vast and fertile plain rimmed by mountains and the sea. Their seat of power, Odawara Castle, stood near the coast of Sagami, nestled against forested slopes and well-traveled roads. It was no ordinary fortress. Its outer walls extended for miles, guarded by deep moats and hidden palisades. The Hōjō had ruled here for generations. They had weathered invasion before, and beaten it back. But Hideyoshi would not be deterred. At the imperial court in Kyoto, he had received the emperor's blessing. His authority stretched beyond the sword, it was now the law of heaven and earth. The age of divided rule was ending, and he had no intention of allowing the Hōjō to remain as a loose thread. If we crush them, he said to his council, eyes fixed on the painted map of Japan stretched before him, the land will at last be whole. In the candlelit silence, his generals bowed. Among them stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, former ally of the Hōjō and now loyal to Hideyoshi. Others, Maeda Tashi, Fukushima Masanori, Kato Kiyomasa, followed with steeled hearts. Hideyoshi's strategy was not born of rage or haste. He did not want a quick battle. He wanted to make an example. He would bring the full weight of the nation's army to the Hōjō's gates and force them to see how far the world had changed. The plan took shape, a march eastward of nearly 220,000 men, the largest army ever seen on Japanese soil. It would be a slow thunder rolling through valleys and mountains. Samurai, warrior class, rode at the vanguard, their armor lacquered and gleaming in the summer sun. Behind them, a shigaru, foot soldiers, carried poles, supplies, and matchlocks. Entire mobile kitchens followed. Carpenters sharpened their blades. Surveyors measured terrain. From the west, they began to move. Castles and towns sent word ahead, Hideyoshi was coming. He didn't burn villages. He didn't pillage. He recruited. Even enemy lands bowed as he passed. Back in Odawara, Lord Hōjō Ujimasa received the news with heavy calm. A man of gray hair and disciplined silence, he gathered his kero, senior retainers, in the great hall. His son, Ujinao, stood beside him, young, proud, and certain that their walls would hold. They have never seen Odawara break, Ujinao said. Then they will make us a story, Ujimasa answered. Odawara prepared. Inside its stone and timber walls, thousands gathered. Soldiers sharpened their yari, spears. Couriers rode to outlying forts. Rations were stockpiled. The people waited. But Hideyoshi was not racing. He was building something greater than a battle. As his forces crossed the Hakone Pass and descended toward Sagami, the wind off the bay carried salt and pine. Villages emptied. Watchtowers were raised in the night. Campfires burned like stars across the hills. On a ridge above the coastal plain, Hideyoshi dismounted and looked down toward the sea. We will not storm it, he said. We will drown it in silence. Odawara waited. But the storm was already here. The sun rose behind heavy cloud as the vast Toyotomi army arrived on the hills around Odawara. To an onlooker from the castle walls, it must have seemed like the sea itself had turned to soldiers. Hideyoshi did not pitch camp in haste. He moved with deliberate patience. First came the scouts, dozens fanning across the terrain to map every ridge, stream, and pass. Then came the surveyors, driving stakes into the ground and marking the lines where trenches, walls, and earthen fortifications would rise. Within days, the hills and fields beyond Odawara were a hive of motion. Hundreds of tents dotted the slopes, and smoke from cooking fires twisted skyward. Drums sounded through the mist at dawn, signaling morning roll calls. Commanders met beneath silk banners, issuing orders passed down from Hideyoshi himself. To the west, battalions fortified the roads to Hakone, laying barriers across mountain passes and narrow trails. To the east, patrols swept the coastline. The blockade began not with blood, but with shovels and rope. Long trenches were dug facing the outer defenses of the castle, deep enough to stop cavalry and wide enough to hold entire formations. Behind them, wooden palisades were raised, forming defensive lines in case of a sortie. Hideyoshi did not plan for a charge. He planned for a prison. "Let them watch us," he told Mayadatashi, who oversaw one of the western encampments. "Let them see how calm our blades stay." To the south, across Sagami Bay, the navy arrived. Hideyoshi's orders had summoned Kuki Yoshitaka and his flotilla, and the ships began to drop anchor just beyond the castle's view. From the cliffs, sentries could see sails drifting like ghosts across the water. Fishermen were barred from launching boats. All sea routes were closed. It was a noose, drawn slowly. Inside Odawara, tension tightened. The walls, once a symbol of pride, now seemed like the rim of a cage. Lord Ujimasa sat in a central tower, silent for long hours. His son, Ujinao, walked the battlements and watched the enemy move. Couriers rode in and out of the gates, but fewer each day. Their eyes told what their mouths could not: the circle was closing. "We are not alone," said Ujinao, trying to reassure the retainers. "Other lords will come. They must." But as the blockade settled in, even the most loyal vassals began to whisper doubts. Messages from Hakagata to the north came slower. Supplies grew tighter. Outside, the Toyotomi banners did not sway. They stood firm in wind and sun, bright against the hills. In the Toyotomi camps, morale ran high. There was little fear. Artisans erected wooden pavilions. Soldiers shared rice and stories around the fires. Doctors treated the sick in open tents. Hideyoshi allowed merchant caravans to follow the army and set up stalls. His men were not idle. They were entertained. Each morning, the fog lifted over the trenches. And each morning, Odawara's defenders saw a world growing more alien. No battles. No arrows. Only quiet. But in that quiet, something moved. It began with a single tea tent. Near the center of the western encampment, one of Hideyoshi's attendants raised a banner bearing the Toyotomi clan crest, above a small wooden structure. Smoke curled from its hearth. Inside, lacquered cups clinked gently and the scent of roasted rice tea spread across the hill. Curious samurai approached. Then a shigaru. Then messengers. They sat cross-legged on tatami mats as servers poured tea and played the shamisen. Within days, more tents followed. Musicians came from Kyoto and Osaka. Performers from distant provinces arrived in ox-drawn wagons. Puppet shows delighted soldiers between drills. Storytellers wove tales of Genji and dragons by firelight. Kabuki actors painted their faces and reenacted ancient tragedies, as laughter rolled across the encampments. Even jugglers and acrobats wandered the roads between the trenches. A city was rising. A city of calm within a war. Hideyoshi called it a festival siege. He understood the mind of the soldier. Battles drained men, but boredom rotted them. And so he gave his army distraction. He gave them joy. Every evening, food was distributed from massive cauldrons. Sake flowed in moderation. But discipline remained strict. Weapons were sharpened. Watches posted. Archers practiced on straw men facing the castle walls. And Odawara watched. From the battlements, Hōjō soldiers stared in disbelief. What had begun as a siege had transformed into a celebration. No horns of war. No towers rolled forward. Instead, the enemy laughed. Danced. Sang. Within the Hōjō court, whispers grew uneasy. "What game is this?" asked one retainer. Ujimasa did not answer. Ujinao stood by the tower window, fists clenched. "They mock us. But Hideyoshi had no need for insult. This was strategy. Psychological warfare played in daylight. The defenders grew restless, then resentful. And as rations shrank and morale frayed, the laughter from the hills only deepened the silence within. "They are not tired," said an old Shigeru inside the castle. "They are multiplying." Worse yet, emissaries from nearby castles no longer sent word. Roads were cut. Allies silent. The only messages that came were whispers of surrender and collapse. By the third week, the festival became routine. Toyotomi soldiers performed music from their home provinces. A group from Satsuma sang with a harmony that carried into the valley below. Dancers twirled in summer robes. Children from nearby villages, brought under protection, ran among the soldiers, laughing. The noise was unbearable to the men of Odawara. Unbearable not for its volume, but for what it meant. The world had changed. The defenders stood in shadow. The enemy danced in the sun. And then, as the Hōjō peered from their walls one morning, a new shape rose in the trees. They noticed it first as a break in the tree line. At dawn, the mist that clung to the hills slowly lifted. And where once there had been only trees, dense, green, and untouched, a strange silhouette now marked the ridge above Odawara. It was angular, rising like a shadow made solid. From the castle walls, sentries blinked and leaned forward. Then the sun broke. Wooden ramparts, roofed towers, and whitewashed walls gleamed down from the hill. The outline was unmistakable. A fortress had appeared. Ishigakiyama, whispered a guard, though the name had not yet been spoken. Panic stirred in the Hōjō ranks. Soldiers and Karo climbed the towers, squinting into the rising light. The fortress overlooked Odawara, its sightlines direct and merciless. Archers within could fire down onto the outer walls. Spotters could track every movement in the castle courtyard. The hill, once dismissed as too steep and forested to threaten them, had birthed a predator. But how? In truth, Hideyoshi had planned it for weeks. While Odawara stared down at the festival grounds and the rolling sea, his engineers and carpenters had vanished into the forest of Ishigakiyama. With teams working in silence and under the cover of foliage, they cleared paths, built frame supports, and assembled prefabricated sections of wall. Supplies were moved at night. Workers were rotated in silence. Hideyoshi's orders were clear: no sound above a whisper, no fires to be lit, and no horses to be driven within earshot of the castle. When it appears, he had said, it must feel as though the earth itself gave birth to it. And it did. By morning, Ishigakiyama Castle stood with full parapets and manned towers. Pennants bearing the Toyotomi crest flew in the wind. Soldiers within took their positions as if they had always been there. In Odawara, disbelief turned to dread. The Hōjō now had to reckon with a new threat, one that not only symbolized Toyotomi's reach but physically looked down on them, a literal manifestation of dominance. Ujinao stood at the outer wall and stared. "They built a castle, while we watched them dance," he said. Ujimasa remained seated in the war chamber, his gaze distant. They were building it the whole time. Discussions among the retainers turned desperate. Could they strike the fortress with a night raid? But Ishigakiyama was now too well guarded. Could they use artillery? Their stores were limited. Worse still, Hideyoshi had artillery of his own, and it was being positioned atop the new fortress walls. That day, the castle drums beat not for attack, but for announcement. Ishigakiyama Castle declared, the siege was no longer a waiting game. It was now a watchful execution. And Odawara had no blind spots left. While Odawara Castle remained unbreached, a quieter war was unfolding in the shadows of the siege. Hideyoshi, ever the strategist, knew that a siege could not be won through isolation alone. The Hōjō heart had to be broken piece by piece. To the north, nestled in the mountains, stood Hakagata Castle. A key stronghold guarding the inland routes to the Kantō plain, it had been a fortress of legend during earlier conflicts. Its walls, built along narrow ridges and sharp valleys, were defended by some of the Hōjō's most seasoned warriors. There, the Hōjō still believed in the dream of resistance. But Hideyoshi had sent a storm. Yasuji Kajikatsu and Maeda Tashi led the assault, combining strength with precision. Their men climbed ravines and forested slopes, setting up artillery on cleared terraces. Night by night, the sound of hammering and shouted orders echoed through the pine-choked valleys. Hakigata's defenders sent out scouts, only for those scouts to never return. Once the siege began, it was ruthless in tempo. Walls crumbled beneath volleys of teppo, matchlock gun, fire and cannon shot. Atop broken palisades, the defenders launched counterattacks under moonlight. But food was scarce, and morale waned. Within 3 weeks, Hakigata fell. Its banners were lowered. The fall sent ripples across the region. Couriers slipped through woodland trails to Odawara, but the news traveled faster than they did. Rumors carried by smoke and whisper arrived first. The northern gate was open. The mountain shield was broken. Within Odawara, Ujinao received the news in a chamber where retainers stood silent. Another candle goes out, one said under breath. South along the coast, other outposts followed. Small fortresses guarding river mouths and supply roads, once thought safe behind natural barriers, now found themselves besieged. Some fell in battle. Others surrendered outright, their commanders choosing life over a hopeless cause. Kunohi Castle, Matsuyama, and even the distant reaches of Musashi began to report disruption. Every outpost lost meant another cord cut from Odawara's strength. Every banner lower deepened the shadow over Ujimasa's command hall. Outside, the Toyotomi camps took notice but did not gloat. Instead, the sounds of new construction could be heard. More trenches. More barricades. More forward bases creeping closer to the castle's western gates. Hideyoshi's strategy was one of erosion. Where once the Hōjō ruled from a network of loyal strongholds, now they watched that network collapse from within. Roads once bustling with supply carts now lay empty. Watchfires that once signaled strength now flickered no more. Even the messengers began to hesitate. One evening, as torches were lit along Odawara's main gate, a lone rider arrived. He wore armor spattered with mud and blood, and his horse trembled from exhaustion. He dismounted, bowed before Ujinao, and said only, "Hakigata has vanished. There is no path left." Ujinao dismissed him without a word. Later that night, he walked alone to the inner wall and looked out toward Ishigakiyama. The lights of the fortress flickered steady, unshaken. Below them, the Toyotomi banners lined the ridges like silent judges. He gripped the hilt of his sword, but drew nothing. The war was no longer about victories. It was about time, and what remained of it. Rain began to fall. At first, it was light, mist blown in from Sagami Bay, softening the earth and coating the rooftops of Odawara with silver. But within days, the skies grew heavy. Summer storms rolled across the hills, thundering above Hideyoshi's encampments and flooding the trenches. In the castle, water seeped into storage rooms and pooled in the outer courtyards. Inside Odawara, the spirits of the defenders sank with the barometer. The loss of the outposts had struck like a blade. Where once the castle had felt like the center of a powerful realm, it now felt like an island. Roads once bustling with traffic now echoed with the emptiness of retreat. There were no more messages from allies. There was no more news. Silence became the loudest noise. Food grew scarce. The storehouses had been well supplied, Odawara's defenses had been planned not for weeks, but for months. But no one had expected a siege without a battle. Hideyoshi's refusal to engage left no opportunity to break free, no skirmish to redeem morale, no outlet for the pressure that now built within the walls. The Ishigaru, once eager and proud, now stood listless beneath dripping eaves. Cooking fires burned lower. Rations were cut. Salted rice balls grew smaller each day. Some soldiers shared stories of their homes in Musashi or Sagami, but others simply stared at the ground. Fear spoke in corners. "What if they never attack?" asked one foot soldier. "What if we die in here without a single sword drawn?" In the halls of power, the divisions grew sharper. Ujinao paced like a caged tiger. He spoke of honor, of defiance, of sending out the cavalry in a night raid. Let us cut our way through to the forest and burn Ishigakiyama to the ground, he urged. But the senior retainers, the Kero, remained cautious. Lord Ujimasa said little. His expression had become unreadable. A council was held in the great hall. Tatami mats creaked under shifting knees as voices rose. We still have warriors. But we have no allies. This is not war. This is humiliation. The debate spiraled. One retainer suggested a surrender on favorable terms. Another demanded seppuku for even speaking of it. Swords were not drawn, but they were thought of. Ujimasa finally raised his hand, silencing them. We will endure, he said. As the mountain endures the rain. But his voice no longer carried conviction. In the barracks, arguments broke out over stolen food. In the stables, horses grew thin. The castle's servants whispered of ghosts, strange shapes seen in the fog beyond the walls. A watchman claimed to have seen firelight from within the forest, not from enemy camps, but deeper, older. The rumor spread like mold. Outside, Hideyoshi's siege lines held firm. Despite the weather, the festival continued. Musicians performed under covered pavilions. Soldiers waded through mud with laughter. Their supplies came daily, escorted from the rear lines. Their fires burned strong. They had no reason to worry. But inside Odawara, every crack in the stone seemed deeper. Even the castle's dogs had gone silent. One night, as the wind howled and lanterns swayed on the walls, Ujinao sat alone with his father. We cannot wait much longer, he said. Ujimasa looked at the old scrolls hanging on the chamber walls, portraits of ancestors, of warriors who had fought under the banner of the Hōjō. If we wait, he replied, they may remember us as patient. If we break, said Ujinao, they will remember us at all. The summer rain did not stop. It deepened. Fields once dry and tilled became marsh. Footpaths turned to streams. The trenches carved by the Toyotomi army filled with water, the earth turning soft and dangerous. Yet still, Hideyoshi gave no order to storm Odawara. Instead, he tightened the siege with quiet resolve. New earthworks were built. Forward trenches were extended in a crescent toward the western gate. Bamboo stakes lined their flanks. In the dead of night, a Shigeru carried bundles of reeds and wooden panels to build breastworks, carefully positioned to provide cover in case of a counterattack. And yet, there were no open battles. Just the scrape of metal in the mud and the flicker of signal fires under a sky choked with clouds. Inside Odawara, the restlessness broke. One group of young samurai, driven by hunger and the sharp edge of pride, launched a raid of their own accord. Under cover of fog, they slipped out through a narrow postern gate and crept down the hillside. Their target was a forward watch station manned by Toyotomi guards. They struck with speed, cutting down several sentries before setting the outpost ablaze. For a moment, they believed the tide had turned. But Hideyoshi had prepared for such moments. A signal drum sounded. Horns blew. And from the trees, a full detachment of arquebusiers emerged, fanning out like shadows given form. Half the raiders were slain. The rest fled into the darkness. The following morning, Hideyoshi made no mention of the raid. Instead, new trenches were dug where the outpost had stood. Fresh stakes replaced the burned walls. To the Hōjō inside, it was as if the raid had never happened, except for the absence of those who had gone. Ujinao, furious, confronted his father and the remaining Kero. Every moment we wait, they grow stronger, he said. Even the mud works in their favor. Indeed, the weather had become a weapon. Rain drowned the hopes of those within the castle, but to Hideyoshi's men, it was merely another element to master. Their supply lines remained active, reinforced with wooden planks and covered bridges. Engineers raised temporary huts for storage and shelter. Timber was hauled in from the surrounding forests to create platforms, dry paths, and small lookout towers that pierced through the canopy. From those towers, scouts observed every ripple on the castle's walls. The Teppo units, idle for weeks, began to demonstrate their power. Each afternoon, a rolling thunder echoed across the fields, not from the skies, but from coordinated volleys. Musket-bearing Ishiguro took turns practicing their aim. The shots echoed through Odawara's halls, a daily reminder that steel and powder waited in patience. A new tactic emerged, night drills conducted in full silence. Toyotomi units would rotate positions after sundown, avoiding routine. No camp was ever where it had been the night before. Lanterns moved in patterns meant to confuse. To the Hōjō, it was as though the enemy walked through mist. The terrain, once the defender's ally, had shifted allegiances. Odawara's outer defenses, ditches and stoneworks meant to slow attackers, now trapped their own men in place. Every gate was sealed. Every movement watched. The defenders no longer dared to light fires after dusk. Inside, torches flickered low. A single cart of dried fish brought tension between kitchen hands. A cook was accused of hiding food. A brawl broke out in the armory. Discipline was not yet broken, but it had thinned. And always, the sound of rain. Then, one morning, the shelling began. Hideyoshi had not forgotten his cannons. They were placed not for destruction, but for impact, literal and mental. A series of loud, sudden blasts struck the slopes just below the castle's walls. Earth flew into the air. Rocks tumbled. No direct hit was made, nor intended. It was performance, like everything else. Inside the Hōjō court, the message was clear: we see you. We reach you. And still, we do not strike. It was the slowest death imaginable for a warrior's pride. It was no longer a siege of weapons. It had become a siege of minds. Hideyoshi's forces tightened their grip not through violence but by severing every path to hope. And so, diplomacy began, not as whispers, but as silence. Letters, carried by emissaries in fine robes, were sent to neighboring lords who had once supported the Hōjō. These messages did not bear threats. They offered futures. From Kai to Shimosa, daimyo, feudal lords, hesitated. They saw the strength that encircled Odawara like a ring of stone, and they weighed their options. Some chose to send no reply at all. Others wrote neutral responses, veiled in politeness. A few quietly reached out to Hideyoshi, pledging loyalty before the storm broke. Within Odawara, the silence was noticed. No reinforcements. No flags on the horizon. No messengers bringing new orders or declarations of unity. The Hōjō, once the anchor of eastern Japan, now stood alone. Lord Ujimasa gathered his council in the Hall of Ancestors. Rain tapped against the wooden shutters. The air smelled of damp straw and old ink. No word from Yamanouchi, he asked. A retainer shook his head. None in 10 days. And from Iwatsuki? Gone. Ujimasa closed his eyes. Then the sea has swallowed the land. Even Tokugawa Ieyasu, once bound to the Hōjō by marriage alliance, had stood beside Hideyoshi at the outset of the campaign. That betrayal, if it could be called such, had cut deepest. He had been given the Kantō in promise. And the promise had been enough. Hideyoshi's tactics were clear: no battle, no fire, just certainty. He offered favorable terms to those who came early. For those who delayed, there would be no reward. Emissaries even came to Odawara itself. One summer morning, a Toyotomi official dressed in crimson robes approached the western gate under a banner of truce. He carried no weapon, only a scroll. He waited beneath the dripping eaves, not flinching as the castle's defenders lined the walls above him with bows. He read aloud. From Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Grand Chancellor of the realm, the time has come to close the book. The legacy of the Hōjō shall be remembered with honor, should it end with dignity. He left the scroll on a lacquered tray and turned away. The scroll was brought to the chamber where Ujimasa sat with Ujinao. Neither spoke as they read it. The message was simple: surrender now, and the son would live. The father, as head of his house, would be expected to choose a warrior's end. Ujinao clenched his fists. They mock us with courtesy. Ujimasa remained still. No. They offer us legacy. Still, hope flickered in some corners. A few retainers clung to the idea that a final battle might break the siege. They pointed to the thinning of Toyotomi patrols in the south, to gaps in the trench lines, to false signs of weakness. But it was not weakness. It was invitation. Hideyoshi, in his command tent, allowed the enemy to believe in small cracks. He wanted them to test the lines, to step outside. And when they did, he tightened the cord again. By late July, the truth was undeniable. Odawara stood alone. The clans of the east had folded into Hideyoshi's banner. The sea routes were sealed. The mountain paths were guarded. There were no more scouts. There were no more letters. Even the wind, it seemed, blew only from the west. The decision came as gently as a falling leaf. It was the first clear morning in weeks. The rain had finally ceased, and the mist that usually shrouded Odawara's slopes lifted to reveal a sky of pale blue. From the castle towers, sentries could see the Toyotomi camps in their full sprawl, vast and unmoving, an empire in miniature. Inside the castle, the mood had shifted. There was no rallying cry, no final defiant plan. Just quiet nods, shared glances, and a readiness that could no longer be mistaken for preparation for battle. Lord Hōjō Ujimasa called his final council. The great hall was subdued. Tatami mats creaked under careful steps. Light filtered through paper screens, revealing dust floating in the air. "We cannot outlast them," he said simply. No one argued. The truth had long been known, but now it had to be spoken. Ujinao, still clad in the armor he had not worn in days, bowed his head. "I will go," he said. "I will accept their terms." Ujimasa nodded. "As the heir, you must endure. The Hōjō name must not vanish. If you kneel today, you may rise tomorrow." A silence followed, one that would never be broken by those who shared it. Later that day, the gates of Odawara opened. For the first time in months, Toyotomi soldiers witnessed Hōjō men cross the threshold without weapons. Ujinao rode out, accompanied by a small delegation bearing white flags and sealed scrolls. His horse moved slowly through the mud, its hooves striking the ground like a heartbeat. He was met by Tokugawa Ieyasu. The two men, once tied by marriage and now by surrender, exchanged no more than a glance before Ieyasu gestured toward a waiting pavilion. There, emissaries from Hideyoshi awaited, along with the official terms of peace. The terms were clear. Ujinao would be spared. He and his wife, Tokugawa's daughter, would be exiled to Mount Koya, a remote monastic refuge far from power. The rest of the clan would be disbanded. Their retainers could pledge themselves to new lords, or face the consequences of rebellion. As for Ujimasa, a warrior's death was expected. He received the word without tremble. That evening, he dressed in his formal robes, white and without embellishment. He lit incense in the family shrine and placed his swords upon a black lacquered stand. He did not speak to many that night. But to one old retainer, he said, "Let them remember that we chose the silence of the blade." The ritual that followed was quiet, orderly, and without spectacle. There were no loud farewells, no cries of grief. Only a whisper of steel, and a final breath given to the house he had once led. When word reached Hideyoshi, he made no proclamation. Instead, he stood outside his tent beneath the same pale sky that had graced the castle that morning. He closed his eyes and murmured a single word. Finished. The siege of Odawara was over. When the gates of Odawara finally opened without resistance, and the Toyotomi banners fluttered over its ramparts, Japan itself seemed to exhale. The final great obstacle to national unification had been swept away, not by fire or siege towers, but by strategy, patience, and inevitability. Hideyoshi did not garrison Odawara. He did not need to. With the Hōjō defeated and scattered, the entire Kantō region fell into his hands without further struggle. And yet, what came next would shape history more than the siege itself. Hideyoshi summoned Tokugawa Ieyasu to his command post. The two men spoke in private, beneath a pine tree bent by the sea wind. What passed between them was not recorded, but its result was soon known across the land. Hideyoshi had granted Ieyasu the entire Kantō region. The former ally of the Hōjō would now rule their lands. It was a gesture of great trust, and a calculated decision. Ieyasu, stripped of his home province, now had to uproot his entire power base and relocate to the east. He accepted without protest. To all who watched, he seemed grateful. But in the quiet halls of his new seat, an old fishing village named Edo, he began to plan. Edo was small, a swamp-rimmed port at the mouth of a wide river. But Ieyasu saw something in its tides. He ordered walls built, moats dug, and roads laid. Slowly, the town transformed. That decision, made in the wake of Odawara's fall, would one day reshape the nation. Edo would grow into Tokyo, and Ieyasu would rise not just as a steward of peace, but as its architect. The Tokugawa shogunate was still years away, but the seeds were planted here. As for Hideyoshi, he returned west in triumph. He had done what Nobunaga had begun, he had united the realm. There were no more enemies to challenge his authority. The emperor himself affirmed Hideyoshi's rule. Peace descended across Japan, enforced by the memory of Odawara. But not all memories faded easily. Among the old guard, the fall of the Hōjō became a symbol. Some viewed it as the end of the age of true samurai honor. Others saw it as the dawn of strategy over strength. And some, like Ujinao, exiled to Mount Koya, lived out their days in quiet reflection, far from the walls where history had turned. Odawara Castle still stood. Its stones weathered, its gates repaired. But the voice of the Hōjō no longer echoed there. Only travelers passed through now, remarking on the size of the walls and the stillness of the hilltop. The age of war had ended. A new road had opened. Thank you for watching this story of The Fall of Odawara. If you enjoyed this historical journey through Japan's unification, consider subscribing to the channel for more epic tales from the age of samurai. Until next time, walk with honor, and remember the lessons of the past.